Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are diving deep into stories that the mainstream press is barely scratching the surface on. We've got China flexing naval muscle in ways that should alarm every defense analyst on the planet. We've got Mexico descending into chaos after the killing of one of the world's most powerful drug lords. We've got Iraq trying to redraw maritime boundaries in the Gulf, and Hong Kong's courts crushing what's left of political dissent. These stories are connected by a single thread: the raw exercise of power by states that believe they can act without consequence.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Alex, you're absolutely right that these stories demand more than the headline treatment they're getting. Let's start with what the South China Morning Post is reporting out of China's Liaonan shipyard in Dalian. Photos have surfaced on Chinese social media showing a massive 155mm naval gun mounted on the bow of a test vessel. Now, 155mm, that's 6.1 inches, doesn't sound dramatic until you understand this would be the single largest gun in the entire PLA Navy arsenal. This is not a defensive weapon. This is a shore bombardment weapon, and everyone paying attention knows what shore they're talking about.
Let's be specific about what this gun is designed to do, because the reporting from the South China Morning Post frames this as a boost to amphibious landing power, and we need to unpack that phrase. An amphibious landing requires you to suppress enemy defenses on a coastline before your troops hit the beach. That's what naval gunfire support does. A 155mm naval gun gives you the same caliber as the most powerful army artillery pieces, but mounted on a ship that can maneuver along a coastline and deliver sustained fire. The question isn't whether China is building this weapon. The question is why they need it right now.
And the answer, Alex, is Taiwan. Let's not dance around it. Beijing has been systematically building every component needed for a cross-strait amphibious assault. They've built the landing ships, the Type 075 and Type 076 amphibious assault vessels. They've built the logistics fleet. They've conducted increasingly aggressive military exercises around Taiwan. And now they're testing the heavy naval gun that would be used to soften up Taiwanese beach defenses before an invasion force lands. This is not ambiguous. This is a military that is methodically checking boxes on an invasion capability list.
What the mainstream coverage is missing is the industrial context. This weapon was spotted at the Liaonan shipyard in Dalian, in Liaoning province. That's China's northeastern shipbuilding hub, and it's one of the yards that has been running at wartime production tempo for years now. China is outbuilding the United States Navy by a staggering margin. They're launching more tonnage annually than the US, UK, and Japan combined. A 155mm naval gun isn't just a weapon system, it's a signal that China's defense industrial base has reached the point where they can develop and field entirely new categories of naval armament while simultaneously building the fleet to carry them.
And here's what should concern defense planners in Washington, Taipei, Tokyo, and Canberra. The estimated barrel length suggests this gun has significant range, potentially far exceeding the standard 127mm guns used by most Western navies. If China pairs this weapon with precision-guided munitions, which they almost certainly will, you're looking at a naval fire support capability that could strike targets 30 to 40 kilometers inland from the coast. That changes the calculus for Taiwan's coastal defense strategy entirely. You can't just defend the beaches anymore. You have to defend deep inland against naval gunfire, and that stretches Taiwan's already limited forces even thinner.
Now let's pivot to Mexico, because what's happening there right now is absolute carnage, and the international press is treating it like a routine cartel story. Al Jazeera is reporting that Mexican special forces have killed the country's most wanted man, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. And in the immediate aftermath of that killing, a wave of retaliatory violence has swept across Mexico. This is not a victory for law enforcement. This is the beginning of a new and potentially more dangerous chapter in Mexico's drug war.
Let's talk about who El Mencho was, because his story tells you everything about how the cartels actually operate. He rose from being a low-level police officer and small-time crystal meth dealer to commanding what the DEA considered one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on earth. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel under his leadership didn't just traffic drugs, they controlled territory, ran extortion networks, infiltrated local and state governments, and built a paramilitary force equipped with armored vehicles, drones, and .50 caliber weapons. El Mencho was effectively running a parallel state within Mexico.
And here's what nobody in the mainstream press wants to say plainly: the killing of El Mencho was almost certainly a political decision as much as a security operation. The timing matters. Mexico's government has been under enormous pressure, both domestically and from Washington, to show results against the cartels. Taking out the most wanted man in the country is the kind of high-profile scalp that generates headlines and buys political breathing room. But anyone who has studied the history of cartel decapitation strategies knows that killing the leader almost never weakens the organization. It fractures it, and fragmentation breeds chaos.
The violence that Al Jazeera is reporting right now, the wave sweeping across Mexico, is exactly what decapitation produces. When you remove a strong central leader like El Mencho, you don't get a peaceful succession. You get lieutenants and regional commanders fighting each other for control. You get rival cartels sensing weakness and moving into CJNG territory. You get retaliatory attacks against security forces and civilians as a show of strength. We saw this exact pattern when Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was captured. We saw it when Arturo Beltran Leyva was killed. The playbook is depressingly predictable, and yet governments keep running it because the headlines look good.
Follow the money on this, Maya. The Jalisco New Generation cartel's primary revenue stream is fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that is killing over 70,000 Americans a year. El Mencho's death does not slow fentanyl production by a single gram. The precursor chemicals still flow from China and India. The labs in Sinaloa and Jalisco still operate. The distribution networks into the United States are still intact. What changes is who profits from that supply chain, and the answer is going to be determined by gunfire in Mexican streets over the coming weeks and months. The human cost of that power struggle will be borne by ordinary Mexican citizens who had no say in any of it.
And we need to connect this to the broader failure of the kingpin strategy that both the United States and Mexico have relied on for decades. The theory is simple: take out the leader, and the organization collapses. But the evidence overwhelmingly shows the opposite. A 2022 study by the Congressional Research Service found that cartel fragmentation after leadership decapitation consistently led to increased violence, not decreased violence. Mexico's homicide rate didn't drop after El Chapo was captured. It surged. We are watching the same mistake play out in real time, and the people who will pay the price are the communities caught in the crossfire.
Let's also ask the uncomfortable question about what the United States' role was in this operation. El Mencho had a $10 million DEA bounty on his head. American intelligence assets have been deeply embedded in Mexico's anti-cartel operations for years. The level of intelligence required to locate and kill someone as paranoid and well-protected as El Mencho almost certainly involved American signals intelligence, satellite surveillance, or informant networks. If Washington helped orchestrate this hit, they share responsibility for the destabilization that follows. And yet, watch, American officials will express concern about the violence while quietly celebrating the kill.
Now, Alex, let's turn to the Persian Gulf, because there's a boundary dispute happening that has the potential to destabilize one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Al Jazeera is reporting that Iraq has submitted new maritime coordinates to the United Nations, effectively redrawing its maritime boundaries in ways that encroach on Kuwait's sovereignty. And the response has been swift. Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have all publicly backed Kuwait's position. When all 5 of your Gulf Cooperation Council partners close ranks against you, that tells you something about the seriousness of what Iraq just attempted.
To understand why this matters, you need the historical context that most coverage is leaving out. Iraq and Kuwait have a tortured history over borders. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait partly on the claim that Kuwait was stealing Iraqi oil through slant drilling and that Kuwait was historically Iraqi territory. That invasion led to the Gulf War, one of the most devastating conflicts in the region's modern history. Iraq's border with Kuwait was formally demarcated by a UN boundary commission after that war. For Iraq to now unilaterally submit new maritime coordinates to the UN is an act of extraordinary provocation that echoes the rhetoric of the Saddam era.
Let's talk about what Iraq is actually after, because this isn't really about lines on a map. Iraq has been trying for decades to develop the port of Al-Fa on the Shatt al-Arab waterway. It's their only real access to deep water in the Persian Gulf, and it's been hampered by the narrow maritime corridor they were left with after the UN demarcation. Iraq's economy is overwhelmingly dependent on oil exports, and those exports flow through that narrow corridor. By pushing new maritime boundaries, Iraq is trying to expand its economic zone, gain more control over shipping lanes, and create space for port development that would reduce its dependence on Kuwaiti and Iranian waters.
But here's the power play that should alarm everyone. Iraq's government is heavily influenced by Iran-backed political factions. Tehran has its own strategic interest in seeing Iraq expand its Gulf footprint, not because Iran loves Iraq, but because a more assertive Iraq creates friction within the GCC. Iran benefits from anything that divides the Gulf Arab states or draws their attention away from Iranian expansion. So when we see Iraq redrawing maritime boundaries, we have to ask whether this move was conceived in Baghdad or in Tehran. The fact that every single GCC state immediately rallied behind Kuwait suggests they're asking exactly that question.
And the GCC response itself is significant, Alex. The Gulf Cooperation Council has been fractured for years. The Qatar blockade from 2017 to 2021 revealed deep divisions. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have had their own quiet disagreements over Yemen and oil policy. For Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to issue a unified statement backing Kuwait's sovereignty, that's remarkable. It tells you that Iraq's move was perceived not just as a challenge to Kuwait, but as a challenge to the entire post-Gulf war order in the region. These countries understand that if boundary changes can be imposed unilaterally, none of their borders are safe.
Watch the UN's response carefully on this one. Iraq submitted these coordinates to the United Nations, which means this is now a matter of international law. Kuwait will almost certainly file a formal objection. The question is whether the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf takes up the dispute, and whether the great powers on the Security Council decide to weigh in. The United States has historically guaranteed Kuwait's sovereignty. That was the entire basis of the Gulf War. But in the current geopolitical climate, with Washington stretched thin across multiple theaters, the question is whether that guarantee still holds with the same conviction.
Now let's turn to Hong Kong, and I want our audience to pay close attention to this story, because what happened in that courtroom is the final nail in the coffin of Hong Kong's independent judiciary. The South China Morning Post reports that a Hong Kong court has dismissed all appeals by 12 opposition activists in the city's largest national security case. These were among 47 people prosecuted for organizing an unofficial primary election in 2020. Let me say that again, they were prosecuted for organizing a primary election. Not a coup. Not a bombing. A vote among opposition candidates to decide who would run in the Legislative Council election.
The court upheld that this unofficial primary was subversive under the national security law that Beijing imposed on Hong Kong in 2020. They upheld a 7-year starting point for jail terms, ruling it was not manifestly excessive. 7 years for organizing a vote. Think about that. In what universe is a primary election an act of subversion? Only in a system where the ruling power has decided that any organized political opposition is, by definition, a threat to be crushed. This isn't justice. This is political persecution dressed in judicial robes, and every legal scholar who isn't bought and paid for by Beijing knows it.
Let's talk about the legal reasoning, because it's chilling in its implications. The prosecution's theory was that these 47 activists conspired to win a majority in the Legislative Council and then use that majority to veto the government's budget, which would force the chief executive to resign under the Basic Law. In other words, they planned to use the democratic mechanisms written into Hong Kong's own constitution as leverage against the executive branch. That's not subversion, that's democracy functioning exactly as designed. The court's decision essentially rules that using legal democratic tools against Beijing's preferred outcome is a criminal act.
And notice who was also part of this ruling: the court upheld the acquittal of barrister Lawrence Lau Wai-chung. That tells you the court is trying to maintain a veneer of judicial independence by letting one person walk while throwing the book at everyone else. It's a calculated move designed to give defenders of the system a talking point. See, the courts are fair, they even acquitted someone. But one acquittal out of 47 prosecutions is not evidence of fairness. It's a statistical rounding error used as propaganda.
What the international community needs to understand is that this case has destroyed Hong Kong's legal profession from the inside. Many of the defendants were lawyers, lawmakers, and civil society leaders. The message to anyone considering entering public life in Hong Kong is unambiguous: if you organize against Beijing's interests, you will be imprisoned. The legal profession, which was once Hong Kong's greatest asset and the foundation of its status as an international financial center, has been hollowed out. International law firms are quietly relocating partners. Foreign judges on Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal have been resigning. The infrastructure of the rule of law is being dismantled piece by piece.
And let's connect this to the broader pattern we've been tracking all evening. In China, we see a military building invasion capabilities while its courts crush dissent in Hong Kong. These are not separate stories. They are two faces of the same authoritarian project. A government that imprisons people for organizing elections at home will not hesitate to use military force abroad. The 155mm naval gun being tested in Dalian and the courtroom in Hong Kong are instruments of the same policy, the policy that says Beijing's authority is absolute and any challenge to it, whether through ballots or bullets, will be met with overwhelming force.
Exactly right, Alex. And look at the pattern across all 4 stories tonight. In every case, we see state power being exercised against people who have no meaningful ability to fight back. Taiwanese civilians who face the threat of naval bombardment. Mexican citizens caught in cartel crossfire triggered by a government operation. Kuwaitis who may see their sovereign waters redrawn by a neighbor with a history of invasion. Hong Kong activists sitting in prison cells for the crime of organizing a vote. The common thread is impunity, states acting as though there are no consequences because, increasingly, there aren't.
The Mexico story is particularly instructive because it shows how even the good guys, the security forces who killed El Mencho, can trigger catastrophic outcomes when they prioritize optics over strategy. The kingpin strategy has failed repeatedly, and yet governments keep using it because it generates headlines. They get to hold press conferences and declare victory while communities burn. The real work of dismantling cartels, cutting financial networks, prosecuting money laundering, addressing root causes of drug demand, investing in community alternatives, that work doesn't make the evening news, so it doesn't get funded or prioritized.
And in the Gulf, we're watching a slow-motion boundary crisis that could escalate dramatically if it's not handled through diplomacy. Iraq's submission of new maritime coordinates to the UN is a bureaucratic act, but bureaucratic acts can have military consequences. Kuwait remembers 1990. The entire GCC remembers 1990. If Iraq pushes this claim and the international community responds with nothing more than statements of concern, it emboldens every revisionist power in the region. Iran watches. China watches. The lesson they draw is that borders are negotiable if you're willing to be aggressive enough.
Let me bring it back to the defense dimension, because these stories intersect in ways that should terrify strategic planners. China is building the naval weapons to invade Taiwan while crushing democracy in Hong Kong. Iran-aligned forces in Iraq are probing Gulf boundaries. Cartels in Mexico operate with military-grade equipment and control territory that sovereign governments cannot reclaim. We are living in an era where the monopoly on legitimate violence that defines the nation-state is being challenged simultaneously from above, by great powers building new weapons, and from below, by non-state actors who are functionally indistinguishable from armies.
And the institutions that are supposed to manage these challenges, the United Nations, international courts, diplomatic frameworks, are failing. The UN Security Council is paralyzed by great power vetoes. International law is selectively enforced. Diplomatic norms are eroding. When Iraq can submit new maritime boundaries to the UN and the best response is a GCC statement, when China can imprison 47 people for organizing an election and face no meaningful sanctions, when the killing of a drug lord is treated as a policy success despite decades of evidence that it makes things worse, these are symptoms of a rules-based order that exists in rhetoric but not in practice.
So what does our audience need to understand? First, on China's naval gun, this is not a future threat. This is a present development with near-term implications. Taiwan's window of relative safety is narrowing every time a new weapon system comes off the production line in Dalian. If you care about preventing a catastrophic war in the Pacific, the time to pressure your government for a credible deterrence strategy is now, not after the first shots are fired.
On Mexico, demand that your representatives stop celebrating cartel kingpin kills and start asking hard questions about the strategy that produces them. Why is the United States still pursuing decapitation tactics when the evidence overwhelmingly shows they increase violence? Why are we not investing in demand reduction, financial intelligence, and precursor chemical interdiction at the same scale we invest in paramilitary operations? The fentanyl crisis will not be solved by killing drug lords. It will be solved by dismantling the economic systems that make the drug trade profitable.
On the Gulf, pay attention. Boundary disputes in the Persian Gulf don't stay bureaucratic for long. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply transits through those waters. Any military escalation there sends energy prices through the roof and destabilizes a global economy that's already fragile. Iraq's move may seem obscure, but it has the potential to trigger a chain of events that reaches into your gas tank, your heating bill, and your grocery store. Demand that your government takes this seriously before it becomes a crisis instead of a footnote.
And on Hong Kong, do not look away. The 47 activists imprisoned in this case include some of the bravest people in the world, people who knew the risks and organized anyway because they believed in democracy. Every time the international community shrugs at another Hong Kong conviction, it tells Beijing that the cost of repression is zero. If your country has a trade relationship with China, demand that human rights be part of that conversation. Buy from companies that have spoken out. Support organizations providing legal defense and asylum for Hong Kong dissidents. Silence is complicity.
That's our show for tonight. We covered a lot of ground, but here's the bottom line. Power is being exercised aggressively by states and non-state actors around the world, and the guardrails that are supposed to constrain that power are failing. The only force that can rebuild those guardrails is an informed, engaged, and angry public. That's you. Read the sources we cited tonight, the South China Morning Post, Al Jazeera. Don't take our word for it. Verify everything. Then act. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Remember, the truth doesn't report itself, and democracy doesn't defend itself. Someone has to do the work, and tonight we're asking you to be that someone. Share this broadcast. Talk to your neighbors. Write to your elected officials. The stories we covered tonight will shape the world your children inherit, and the shape of that world depends on whether enough people decide to pay attention. Thank you for watching Truth Report. Stay informed, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.